welcome you all to this ninth meeting that we're having for the state and regional centers of excellence, which is being done in collaboration with AIMS New Delhi and the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare. And we've had a number of very interesting meetings with good interaction. But I think the meeting is just these webinars are just the starting point of what we need to do subsequently at each regional level of trying to roll out good practices right up to the periphery. And this is a big challenge because COVID-19 is a disease where there is a lot of confusion and treatment based on WhatsApp messages rather than the science behind it. And if you go by the science behind it, the treatment itself is not that complex, but the WhatsApp messages and the infodemic that we're going through makes it more complex, and sometimes we do more harm than good. Today, we are going to discuss on tests for COVID-19 and their interpretation, and this will focus both on the diagnostic tests and I hope also on the biomarkers. Now, the diagnostic test is important for us to understand what is the position of each of the tests that we have in terms of the RT-PCR based test, the antigen based test, the rapid antigen test, and how do we use them in a clinical scenario. It's very important. We've been doing that for a long time. And of course, the whole issue of what is the utility of various biomarkers. Before we go on to that and I give my comments, I'll ask the Shri Lava Agarwalji from the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare to give his opening remarks. Over to you, Shri Lava Agarwalji.
Thank you, Dr. Saab. Once again, we welcome all our colleagues from Regional Center of Excellence and State Center of Excellence for this webinar by AIMS. I'll start by 2 points which Dr. Guleria Saab has mentioned, that all these webinars are primarily the starting points. Second point he did mention is that treatment is not complex, infodemic is making it complex. So the need of the hour for all of us presently is to focus on how to demystify COVID management and treating this as a starting point. How do we go down to the masses down below and particularly to our healthcare fraternity across the country? As part of this, since we are going to talk about testing today, I would like to specifically highlight this message that the revised guidelines now primarily focuses on extensive utilization of rapid antigen tests. Why I'm highlighting this issue is primarily because of the fact that earlier Government of India, Ministry of Health had been saying 70% RT-PCR and 30% RAT should be the optimum combination. But as you all are aware that based on the evolving scenario of COVID-19, our guidelines have also evolved. Considering the fact that timely identification, timely isolation becomes very critical in management of COVID-19, and the fact that the cases are now coming from tier 2 and tier 3 towns across the country. Early identification through RAT will be a crucial element in terms of timely treatment to be started for those patients. With that as the starting point, again, we have to sort of highlight at the field level that how do we keep on further increasing our capacity for RT-PCR parallelly, besides focusing on how those RT-PCR labs should function in terms of timely result to be given, considering that there is going to be huge workload in terms of managing the number of testing which needs to be done, because now it is about tier 2 and tier 3 towns parallelly. It is equally important that we also highlight, I'm sure our colleagues from AIMS will also highlight, that while we await the RT-PCR result, how and why it is very important that not only the patient get isolated, but he also get admitted in the suspect ward into the COVID hospital and there is no delay in treatment. So this also becomes a crucial element, because sometimes there are field level feedback that patient admission is getting delayed. That is why Ministry of Health has issued specific directions under Disaster Management Act for all the states to sort of ensure that no patient actually gets delayed in admission. With these words, I look forward for support of all the colleagues from Regional Center of Excellence and State Center of Excellence, wherein just to highlight that before coming to this webinar, I had just written a request to all the Secretary Health of the states to get in touch and coordinate with their State Center of Excellences and Regional Center of Excellences to make a district level training plan of action and take it down to all the health fraternity across the country. Thank you once again for your contribution. We look forward that we now take it down to the health fraternity at large. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I think this is something that each regional centers will have to do. We could collaborate and really come out with training modules if you want, for each of these areas, which can be then used at a, let's say, district level or at a ground level in terms of the training program. And then that can be done online or through various other means, so that everyone right down to the district level or the primary health center level has some knowledge and has a little bit of an idea, even if it's just one pager of what he should do, what he should not do, when to start which treatment, when not to start which treatment. Same is for the test, to understand the utility of each test. I think the most important thing is to understand that in the given scenario, the rapid antigen test is very useful. In a scenario when the number of cases, your positivity rate is high, the rapid antigen test performs exceptionally well. We found it very useful during the first wave. Then when the cases came down, the rapid antigen test was not very useful. It was showing, because your pre-test probability was low and it was not that useful. But now we have been able to decrease our RT-PCR load by almost 50% by going aggressively on rapid antigen test. And we have a policy that any patient who has symptoms, who comes to the emergency, the first thing that we do in all patients is the rapid antigen test. Within 5 to 10 minutes, you know whether it's COVID positive or not. He is then immediately shifted to the COVID area, and treatment is started. If you have a negative rapid antigen test, you must follow it up by an RT-PCR based test. That is very important to keep in mind. A positive test definitely suggests that this is COVID, but a negative test doesn't rule it out. What we've done in the emergency is, because we need to really quickly take decisions, we can't wait. So there we get 24/7 the CB-NAT test done. The CB-NAT will give you a result within 2 hours. So all patients who are coming into the emergency, all patients who are going in for emergency surgery or need any emergency intervention, it could be cardiac, it could be neuro intervention, it could be some other procedure that is required, all of them undergo a CB-NAT test and you get the report within 2 hours. For routine workup, for our staff patients and others who are routinely coming up and need a date who are having a routine procedure and need to be tested, there we use the standard RT-PCR test, and we have a turnaround time that if you give it in the morning, by afternoon you get the report. If you give it in the afternoon, by late night you get the report. So we try and maintain a cycle so that within 8 to 12 hours you get a report. So I think each area will have to stratify how best they can use the test so that you are able to provide your results very quickly and optimize the utility of the test in a given scenario. So rapid antigen test, very useful. It can also be useful in a field area where quickly you can diagnose patients who are positive and isolate them, especially when you have a high positivity rate. At the same time, we must understand, as was mentioned by Shri Love Agarwal, that often when your tests are taking time, especially in field conditions where sometimes the RT-PCR test may take even 2-3 days, a syndromic approach is also important to keep in mind. Look at the patient's symptoms, and if it is suggestive, then make a presumptive diagnosis of COVID-19, isolate and start the overall COVID-19 management protocol. Finally, coming to the use of biomarkers. In my mind, biomarkers, without looking at the clinical picture, have very limited utility. They are more misused than used, because now everyone is getting biomarkers done, and people have started treating biomarkers rather than the clinical patient or the patient himself. You may have a patient who has no fever, he's asymptomatic, saturation is maintained, but if D-dimer is slightly high, he will be put on the novel oral anticoagulants, or he may be put on Ecosprin. If his CRP is slightly high, he's put on steroids. This is not something which is right, and this is causing a lot of problems in the long run, and I think that is something very important to understand. So today, to really discuss the test for COVID-19 and their interpretation, we have Dr. Manish Suneja, who will be talking on this from the Department of Medicine. And the panelists that I have are Dr. Anjan Trikha, who has been here a number of times, and Dr. Neeraj Nischal, who will also be taking up your questions. So I'll now request Manish to start his presentation, and then later on we can have questions. Over to you, Manish.
Thank you, sir. So what I did was I basically focused more on the biomarkers part of it. I have covered some part of diagnostics as well, and we can obviously discuss all the things. Right now, we are all inundated. We are all receiving WhatsApp messages, stable patients, home isolation, mild patients, and they are sending reports which runs into 10 pages with all sorts of biomarkers done. So I thought we might focus a little bit more on biomarkers part. So the most important question that plagues us, the clinician, is the most difficult question that we face is the enigmatic disease course. Now we do know about these that 80%, 80 to 85% have mild disease, 15 to 20% of patients have aggressive disease. But how a given individual will behave when we see the patient in the first week of illness with mild symptoms, we really do not have a very conclusive tool to identify. Yes, we know there are various clinical markers like chronic liver disease, chronic kidney disease, diabetes, uh, elderly population who are likely to have aggressive disease course. They are, of course, good markers, good tools, but we still need better tools to identify patients who are likely to have aggressive disease, and thus we need to identify them, and uh, this is required for proper allocation of resources. So now the one thing which is being done rampantly is radiological investigation. You see daily CT scans are being sent. This was discussed yesterday. This actually is not at all warranted, should not be done in patients in home isolation, but we are getting such things. But today we'll be focusing on the lab part of it, laboratory biomarkers. So simple search, literature search, what has been done in last 1 year. So this is just one of the systematic reviews. We see a long list of biomarkers from lymphopenia, thrombocytopenia, you have creatinine, you have liver enzymes, LDH. This is just a representative list. There are other biomarkers too, and all of them have been shown to have a independent prognostic association with outcomes of progression to severe disease and mortality in COVID. So now which one should we be doing? We have to be pragmatic. We cannot be ordering such a long list of biomarkers. And that is what we are trying to address today. To keep the thing simple, what I have prepared is in a simple question and answer format relating to testing, which we encounter in our day-to-day clinical practice. So let's see. So should routine investigations be done in all mild patients in home isolation? This is a simple one. Answer is no. Majority of these patients have a quick recovery within 5 to 7 days, and management rests primarily on providing symptomatic treatment. Routine blood investigations would not alter the course of the disease or the treatment decisions, so it should not be done. However, we do see that many patients are getting it done. In fact, the laboratory resources are overburdened because of routine testing done for all patients, a large proportion of patients. So if we do not do it for all patients, should inflammatory markers be done in mild patients in home isolation who have risk factors for severe disease? So someone, let's say there are risk factors for severe disease like diabetes, CLD, etc. Should we be doing inflammatory markers, CRP, etc. During the period of home isolation? The answer would be no. These markers will go up in any infection, and the cutoff levels for these biomarkers requiring treatment decisions are not defined. So like in any other infection, CRP levels will go up. Till date, in last 1 year, whatever we have learned, we have do not have sufficient evidence to say about what level of CRP one should be actually treating the patient. And in fact, probably a serial value is more important than a single marker. In any case, a single reading of CRP cannot be taken for taking treatment decisions. So again, the answer is no. Even in high-risk patients who are having mild symptoms in home isolation, inflammatory markers are not warranted. Now, should D-dimer be done in mild patients with risk factors for severe disease? Often we come across patients who have a history of coronary artery disease or a history of stroke, they obviously have this concern whether this COVID may lead to such events, recurrence of such events. Again, if we see, the answer will be no, because most of these patients of mild disease are ambulatory. They recover spontaneously and have a very low risk of thromboembolism. A high D-dimer level alone does not warrant use of anticoagulants in this patient population. And neither measuring the D-dimer will alter the course of disease or the type of management. So again, home isolation patients, mild patients, actually no investigations are required. Then we come to this gray zone. So we have mild patients in home isolation, moderate patients in the hospitals, moderate and severe. Then there is a gray zone, patients who are progressing from mild to moderate. The one group of patients which the national protocol talks about giving steroids in a select population who are fulfilling certain criteria. Now the obvious question comes, should inflammatory markers like CRP be done in patients with prolonged fever before starting steroids as warranted, as given in the national protocol? Oh, this is open to debate, but as of now, our current understanding from the evidence that has been gathered in last 1 year, the answer remains no. Majority of patients with prolonged fever will have some degree of raised inflammatory markers, CRP in particular, and the levels of CRP is variable across patient population, and no cutoffs have been identified to recommend steroids. In fact, if you look at the data, some studies talk about CRP levels 5 times upper limit of normals, other talk about 8 times, some talk about 10, 12 times. So a single value, we do not know what is the cutoff above which a treatment should be initiated. So if we see, our national guidelines are quite pragmatic at it. It talks about only clinical decision making on the basis of symptoms rather than based on tests. So now we come to admitted patients. The tests that we do in admitted patients, we will just stick to our national protocols. The protocol, what we do is a CBC, LFT, KFT, CRP, D-dimer, and IL-6. Let's see what are the common questions related to these. Often, a thing which we often ignore is the lymphocyte count, the trend of lymphocyte count. So there are ample studies. I have just picked up one of them. It shows that lymphocyte counts an early predictor. So low lymphocyte count that we see, this red line is non-survivors, blue line is survivors. So pretty early on in the course of the disease, even within the first week, we see absolute lymphocyte counts are pretty on the lower side in patients who have a poorer prognosis compared to patients who are having good prognosis. Now, different studies have given different cutoffs. Most of them talk about absolute lymphocyte count of less than 800 being associated with poor outcomes. The neutrophil lymphocyte ratio, again a very ignored marker. A rising neutrophil count indicates increasing intensity of the inflammatory response, whereas a falling lymphocyte count indicates the damage to the immune system. So we have a raised NLR ratio. But we have to keep in mind, obviously, these are all before initiation of steroids, but obviously steroids will alter this, will increase the NLR ratio. So only the first value before giving the steroids, only at that time we can go by what absolute lymphocyte count and NLR is showing that they may be a predictor of the disease trajectory. So most various cutoffs again has been given for NLR. So most of them talk about NLR ratio of 3 to 5 times, predicting a poor, severe disease course. Now let's come to the most important marker that we talk about, that is of C-reactive protein. It is an acute phase reactant, well-established biomarker in many conditions. The good part is that the levels closely correlate that with of interleukin-6, the fancy cousin that we have really been using in the last 1 year. But there are many benefits of CRP above the interleukin-6, which is why it should be used. It includes a half-life 19 years, which is constant and comparable across different. Sorry for the interruption. So we talked about the importance of absolute lymphocyte count, a very often ignored parameter that we do. Particularly, we see in this group of patients, what we see in this study among non-survivors, the absolute lymphocyte count is lower, and this happens pretty early in the disease course, in the first week of illness, compared to those with good prognosis. Obviously, this may get affected by use of steroids. So early in the first absolute lymphocyte count does give us an idea about the possible disease trajectory. Neutrophil lymphocyte ratio, again, less often used parameter, which we should be using more often. A rising neutrophil count signals that the intensity of inflammatory response is increasing, and a falling lymphocyte count is a symbol of damage to the immune system. So this increased NLR ratio is seen in many inflammatory conditions. It is seen in COVID, and obviously this can be confounded by glucocorticoid therapy or by bacterial infections. However, this is an important parameter, particularly in the early part of the disease, early second week of the disease, where a high NLR ratio, which has shown to be anywhere between 3 to 5 times, to be an independent risk factor for progression to severe COVID. Now let's come to CRP. Now CRP is a very important, is the most important prognostic biomarker in COVID. It is an acute phase reactant. It levels are also closely correlates with that of interleukin 6, which is a fancy cousin which we have been using in last 1 year. But there are many advantages of CRP which we don't have in its fancy cousin. The half-life of CRP is 19 hours and is constant across different age groups. And this is not true for interleukin 6. Also, the measurement of CRP is rapid, is standardized, and is relatively inexpensive. So we should be using CRP more often than its fancy cousin. Many studies have shown correlation of CRP with disease severity and predictor of mortality. So like one such study, group of patients, there was mortality and survivor when it was compared. We see CRP levels as such is quantitatively is much higher among patients who died compared to those who survived. The CRP level does go up in the first 2 weeks of illness in all patients, even those who survive. But it came back quite rapidly around 10 to 12 days. It comes back to its baseline status, and it doesn't do so in the patients who have poorer prognosis. A very recent paper which has come, it's a retrospective analysis from a New York hospital. Very interesting thing they have shown. The prognostic value of CRP as an early indicator for therapeutic response. So what we have here is patients who were given steroids, analyzed retrospectively. This blue line are the patients who were CRP responders. That is, the steroid use decreased the CRP by at least 50% within 72 hours. And in patients in which it didn't decrease by 50%, they were classified as non-responders. And this is the probability of survival. So we see among non-responders, the probability of survival was definitely lower than among responders. So meaning by this CRP level, if we repeat within 72 hours of administration of steroids in admitted patients only, it is an early indicator for therapeutic response. So to summarize, admission CRP level predicts disease severity and in-hospital mortality, thereby aiding in allocation of resources. Serial CRP levels during hospital course provide more predictive power than a single value. And because of its short half-life, a large fall in CRP level, at least 50% from baseline with treatment, predicts therapeutic response. So now let's see a couple of questions with CRP. How often should CRP be repeated in admitted patients? Now, our national protocol is pretty liberal. It allows us to repeat CRP in moderate patients every 48 to 72 hourly and in severe patients every 24 to 48 hourly. But we should be using our clinical judgment. Though we are given the liberty, we should be using it judiciously. So for example, a patient with moderate disease who is on oxygen 4-5 liters has been started on steroids, and you see after 3 days in the rounds, the patient is off oxygen or is on minimal oxygen. So really the clinical parameter should be paramount. There's no point repeating a CRP value in this patient to show the decline, because clinically he's improving, we need not repeat it. Obviously, whenever there is worsening of clinical status, it can be repeated. Now coming to his fancy cousin, prognostic value of IL-6. Large number of studies have shown its correlation with disease severity. Some have shown with mortality, others have not shown with mortality. However, whatever data evidence we have for last 1 year, what we understand is serial values could be more meaningful than a single value because it has a very short half-life. But we have to keep in mind, sample processing is very important here. A delay in sample processing, what happens is the interleukins are released spontaneously from the blood cells over time. And whenever it is agitated or shaken while being transported, we will have a falsely elevated value. Also, clinically based assays that we have available with us, they are not as good as research grade. So the values sometimes go haywire. And really, even last 1 year of research, we do not have any paper which has shown any added value of IL-6 over CRP. So we really should not be doing IL-6 in any manner. CRP should be the most important prognostic marker. So the question is, should IL-6 tests be done in all admitted patients? Obviously, the answer is no. And it may be done only in the small minority of admitted patients who require immunomodulator therapy directed at IL-6 pathway. However, information provided by IL-6 can also be obtained easily from CRP. In fact, if we see the randomized control trials over 1 year, whatever has been done with tocilizumab, that is IL-6 pathway inhibitors, they have all used CRP as the entry criterion. So again to stress, CRP is more important than IL-6. Now, many patients are also getting this done, ferritin, LDH. Should they be done in all admitted patients in addition to CRP? Answer is simple, no. All three of these markers provide similar type of information regarding the disease trajectory. And majority of the studies on use of immunomodulator therapy in admitted patients have used CRP as a core inflammatory marker. As well, CRP is more easily available, standardized, and cheap. So these markers should also not be required in management of patients. Coming to D-dimer, we all know about COVID-associated coagulopathy, where we have elevated fibrinogen, D-dimers with minimal change in PTA, PTT, and platelet count, particularly in early stages of infection. The elevated D-dimers have been shown to be associated with increased mortality. There are many studies. The point to note is look at the levels. They have seen the difference in levels between critical and non-critical patients. We see a wide variation. So you see 2.6 versus 0.7. We have 10.2. We have 2.4. In hundreds, 443. Obviously, there are many limitations, including inter-assay variability. So a definite value of D-dimer, we do not know which value of treatment would be warranted. So whatever evidence we have for D-dimer, we can say that admission D-dimer is associated with disease severity and mortality, and a rising D-dimer levels portend COVID-19 associated coagulopathy. However, the use of D-dimer levels to guide anticoagulation remains unknown as of now. So in our national protocol, the use of anticoagulant is not linked to D-dimer. So we give either OD dose in patients who are having moderate disease and BD dose in patients who are having severe disease. It is in no way related to D-dimer. So the next question obviously is, should D-dimer be repeated every 48 to 72 hours for all admitted patients? Well, the answer is in selected patients, yes. Rapidly rising D-dimer will portend a poor clinical course, so it may be documented. And D-dimer is one of the main components of COVID-19 associated coagulopathy. But however, if you look at it closely, so this is from one of the studies, the D-dimers were looked upon from onset of illness, and in blue lines are the survivors, and those of non-survivors. So D-dimer levels. We see these begun to diverge pretty early in the second week of illness. So that is the time when the patients get admitted with us. We see a good difference between those having a good prognosis with those having a bad prognosis. And in any case, these patients will be started on low molecular weight heparin or unfractionated heparin as per indication. It really clinically doesn't make any sense whether it is 14 or 16 or 23. It won't make any changes in our clinical decision making. So again, serial repeating of D-dimer is also not warranted. Should D-dimer at discharge guide decision to extended anticoagulation? Well, this is an area of debate, but as of now, what we understand, the answer should be no, because the incidence for post-discharge thromboembolism is low and is generally similar to individuals hospitalized for acute medical patients. Now, just touching upon one or two questions on diagnostic tests. Can rapid antigen? The question is very important. Now, small towns, villages, cities, obviously the availability of RT-PCR is an issue. So yes, in selected circumstances, it can replace, given its very high specificity of more than 99%. Positive antigen test establishes the diagnosis of COVID-19 and it does not require RT-PCR assay. Obviously, there are certain caveats. The sensitivity is a symptomatic patient and done in early, that is in early 4 to 5 disease of infection in the community are present, that is RAT should be followed by a confirmatory RT-PCR assay. So if we go by figures that we just talked about, just to give some numerical color to it. So if given the prevalence of COVID-19 currently in the population, let's say it's around 20, in Delhi it is 19. So, and the sensitivity of our test, rapid antigen test, is 70%. So we see under these circumstances with a very high prevalence, the positive predictive value is very high, 97%. Contrast this with something when the prevalence is low, let's say 5%, the positive predictive value is 88%. So obviously under current circumstances with the high prevalence in the population, RAT can be used as a substitute for RT-PCR. However, negative patient should also be tested whenever there is clinical suspicion by RT-PCR. Final question. Does the presence of SARS-CoV-2 variants leads to false negative RT-PCR test results? Answer is no. The mutations are emerging mostly in the spike protein area, whereas available RT-PCR assays use multiple genetic targets. So it is unlikely to miss the virus, the diagnosis. So the take-home message is, no tests required for patients with mild disease in home isolation. We should conserve our resources. Absolute lymphocyte count and NLR are inexpensive markers. Although they are confounders, we should be aware of that. A baseline CRP and D-dimer in moderate and severe patients are useful. And the trend is more important than the single value, especially when we talk about the most important marker, that is the CRP. And finally, above all, the single take-home message, if there is any, that is always use inflammatory markers in light of clinical picture. The clinical picture is the best guide to patient management. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Manish Suneja, for really highlighting and clarifying a lot of issues that are linked with biomarkers. This is an era where we have moved more and more from clinical medicine, but we're paying a big price for it as far as the COVID-19 pandemic is concerned, because most often, because of the fear of, really looking at the patient, if I put it that way, doctors are more comfortable by looking at the CT scan and the biomarker report and treating patients rather than actually looking at what is the condition of the patient, what is his saturation, how is he looking, what are his symptoms, and what is the fever profile. So it's very important to realize that these biomarkers alone have very limited utility. Also, the whole array of biomarkers that we get done, and the number keep increasing. And as was mentioned, sometimes you have huge pages of reports which are sent by patients on WhatsApp, have really very limited role. So you should, one should be able to give this message that the biomarkers have limited role on their own, not needed in mild disease. And even in moderate to severe disease, there's just 2 or 3 biomarkers that you need to go by. You don't need to regularly get LDH, ferritin, and so many other tests that are being done. If you just look at things like your CBC, look at the NLR, or look at the CRP and D-dimer, I think that should be just good enough to give you an idea. And as far as testing is concerned, we've already discussed about that. Before I ask the panelists, or maybe first I can ask the panelists, Dr. Anjan Trika and Dr. Neeraj Nischal, if they have anything to say, and then anyone in the group if they have anything else to add. So over to you, Dr. Anjan.
So I think you rightly pointed out the misuse of the test and the biomarkers. I would just like to share with the panelists that if you go to the private setup, biomarkers would cost you anything from 18 to 22,000 rupees. And nobody really knows that what does ferritin does, what does LDH do. And, you know, it's kind of, we are helping the economy to be on the move, nothing more than that. At the same time, yesterday only we got a email from our own lab saying that let us be very careful. A lot of IL-6 has been asked for on a daily basis or alternate basis. So we must try to curtail it. And the same thing is with the test. I know of so many families in Delhi who are doing RT-PCR twice a week with their drivers and maid helps who come to their house just to feel safe. I think we need to spread this to not only ourselves, to all our institutions, but to the general society, that let's not do tests just because we want to feel comfortable, and just because instead of a hemogram or a TLC, DLC, the first report which you get on a WhatsApp is IL-6, LDH and ferritin. And I don't know what is happening, who ordered it. There has to be certain guideline to maybe these labs who are doing it, that you can't do an IL-6 for everybody and anybody who comes in because he's willing to pay 22,000 rupees. Mark my words, there's going to be a shortage of all these kits in our country. And then again, there'll be a next huge press releases on kits for IL-6 and ferritin and LDH. That's all.
Yes, sir. Over last 1 year, what we have seen is that the clinical status of the patient is the best prognostic marker. Apart from that, no other lab markers can actually tell us whether this patient is going to have a poor outcome or a good outcome. So spending 5 minutes of time with the patient, I think, can save all these lab investigations. And in fact, we can treat patient in a better way. So rather than focusing on what lab parameters are, because most of the time what we have observed that these lab parameters lag by at least 24 to 48 hours from the actual status of the patient. So if patient is dipping today, the lab values of 48 hours later is usually not normal. So what we have observed that it's not helping us in any way, except if we are talking to the patients, if we are talking to them, and if you see patient is breathless, he or she is not able to complete his or her sentence, then these are subtle markers. These are the prognostic markers that patient is not doing well and he or she requires more close monitoring or intervention. So I think we should focus more on clinical judgment rather than lab values.
Okay, thank you. Before I ask Madam to give her comments, I think she had raised her hand. I will just introduce Dr. Ambuj Roy, also Professor of Cardiology, who is now standing in for Dr. Rajiv. And Ambuj will then take the questions and also the coordination from the various panel members in case they have any question and they could raise their hand. So over to you, Ambuj, and Madam has a question, had raised her hand also.
So good afternoon, sir. I fully agree with the other panelists that we should conserve our resources now and more focus on the NLR and the CRP, that is the good predictor of the severity and the prognosis also. I wanted to have one question. Some patients, they present with the transaminitis only, like those already having 4 to 3 times higher level of their SGOT and SGPT. So in such patients, sir, what to go with because some patients already they have taken Tamiflu also, and how to go with because remdesivir again is like 4 to 5 times the level we are not going to give. So should we go with only steroids and heparin like in such cases, and how to manage these cases?
Yes, this is a problem that we've also had. Is sometimes the patient needs remdesivir, but his liver function is deranged. Neeraj, do you want to answer that question?
So somehow her voice cracked, so I could not exactly pick the questions.
So the question is, you have a deranged LFT and the patient has moderate illness. Now, what treatment will you give? Because you can't give remdesivir because of the LFT that's deranged. Anjan can also then come in, and then I'll ask Ambuj to take over.
So again, we have been talking about over last 1 week that only oxygen, steroid, anticoagulation at right time in right dose saves life. So even if a patient is not suitable for remdesivir, it doesn't matter. It's not going to change the overall outcome. That's very clear. So rather than focusing on remdesivir, this deranged LFT, if it is because of COVID, could actually act as a prognostic marker, then these patients actually require more close monitoring. So rather than focusing on how to give remdesivir, we should focus how to ensure that the patient does not desaturate. If desaturating, then how to maintain his oxygen saturation, how to give steroid, and if there is, because if the patient is in liver failure or something of that sort, giving anticoagulation blindly may actually be counterproductive. So we have to see if PT-INR is perfectly fine or the patient has deranged INR. So just we should not start anticoagulation blindly just like that, because we have to give. So if a patient has deranged LFT, INR should also be monitored before initiating any of these therapies.
What I would like to say here is that as a protocol for most of our patients, we would have an LFT on board on day one, which really comes to us within 3 to 4 to 5 hours before we start remdesivir. And it's not uncommon. Let's say about 20% times we see that on day 2 or day 3, the LFT shows slightly elevated SGOTs, SGPTs, which are not really more than 4 to 5 times, but about 3 times or something. So we have to give a break and wait. There could be other causes of a rise of these SGOTs and SGPTs also. Also, in the last 14 months or so, we have seen patients who have landed up with bradycardia with remdesivir, and we need to have to stop them or avoid it for a couple of days and then restart them. I am also aware of 2 doctor patients in our setup who had horrible nausea, vomiting after remdesivir's 2 doses or 3rd dose, and they were not given the rest of the doses. Neeraj has rightly pointed out that remdesivir and Tosi is the buzzword in India now. Everybody wants to buy it, get it at whatever cost, but we need to tell everybody that they are not wonder drugs. They are not going to be, very useful if not given at the right time.
Right. Yeah, but Bhatia, you want to add something? You'll have to unmute yourself, sir.
I'm sorry. Yeah, just wanted to know the opinion of all the panelists whether we should have a national policy that should be, there should be binding on the doctors, Western doctors, on what investigation should be done and what treatment should be done. We have already discussed a lot of unnecessary investigations and treatment being given to the patients from every nook and corner, every clinic, every hospital, which they can't justify. If we have some kind of guideline and with some binding on doctors that they should not go overboard on CT scans and all these drugs, all kinds of drugs which are available, maybe around 40, 50 kinds of drugs treatments, which is being prescribed. So, just wanted to have your opinion, whether is it possible to have a guideline with binding on the doctors, some sort of. Though it is a democratic country, I know, and free economy, but still, just to avoid the over investigations and over treatment, just to avoid that.
So I agree with you. This is a huge challenge. I mean, for even this was there in the pre-COVID era. There was a lot of push to have a restriction even for certain antibiotics, high-end antibiotics to prevent antimicrobial resistance. But that could not work out. Antibiotics are available over the counter. You could go and buy Meropenem if you wanted from a chemist without even a prescription. And that is causing a huge problem as far as antimicrobial resistance is concerned. And I still remember at that time, there were patients who were coming with multi-drug resistant pathogens and they were getting very sort of low dose Meropenem, 500 milligrams a day in some clinic, and then they were coming here. So I think I do agree with you, we should have some aggressive system, but how to implement it is a huge challenge. And that is the biggest problem in our country. It's open to other panelists to give their comments.
Sir, I think Dr. Bhatia has said something which is true, but it is very unlikely that we can do that in our country. A single statement about radiation doses for CT, which you correctly made, got a lot of responses from radiological associations all over the country. There is no statutory body which can avoid tests being done in private labs, including blood, urine, or radiological labs in any part of our country. It is simple business, we all know it. And then it just tends to happen, and a patient somehow in India is very happy to do a CT every 15 days, do a test every 10 days and feel good about it. And along with those tests, what is happening is, and we have all seen it, with the normal level, below that normal level, there is a paragraph of information from maybe a laboratory book or Harrison or Davidson, which is mentioned there, which everybody tries to read and interprets. So by the time you get that report, somebody has already interpreted it to CRP levels in inflammation or D-dimers into anticoagulation. Dr. Bhatia, you are right. We need to have some stringent policy, but I think it's not possible in these pandemic times.
That's right. I mean, fortunately, freedom, we love our freedom and everybody loves to use it in all fields. So
Would you say
there's
too much of freedom?
let's not get into the controversial areas. So there's one very relevant question. Maybe Manish, you can take it first, and then Neeraj. Is that can persistent elevation of CRP guide for continuation of steroids beyond 10 days in severe COVID pneumonia?
So, so CRP level elevation, the responders that we discussed about that CRP decrease on steroid use have been shown to be associated with good prognosis. Most of the times, steroid that we give is for 5 to 10 days duration. However, again, the clinical judgment should be supreme. If the patient is getting better and has an isolated elevated CRP level, we should not be chasing the lab reports, and we really need not continue steroid just to suppress the CRP levels. So if we're clinically responding, we need not do so.
So if I may just add, or maybe ask the question to the panelists, sometimes the issue is that the person's saturation is maintained. On the 10th day, he starts having fever again, and the CRP level goes up. Is that an indication for giving steroids or not? What is the opinion of the house? Because the recovery trial looked at steroids only if your saturation was falling in and those who had moderate to severe illness. But now you have some features of ongoing inflammation and recurrence of fever, but patient is not having any fall in oxygen saturation and he's all right. Do you think low dose steroids will help or not? Neeraj, what is your opinion? And then maybe we can ask others on the panel.
Sir, repeat occurrence of fever, especially in the range of 101, 102, is something which we have to be careful. And if patient normally start showing a downward trend of saturation by that time, this is what we have been seeing. And once if somebody had a range of say 95 to 99 before this recurrence of fever and saturation range is now say 92 to 95, then I think these patients may benefit from low dose steroid. And if the other parameters and other clinical findings are suggestive that he might actually worsen with time. So yes, but not all patients. If somebody has say 100-degree fever on 10th day again, but his saturation is perfectly fine, the prior saturation is there, so we can observe him. Maybe we can give something like naproxen to counter this fever, which is also a good anti-inflammatory from that point of view, and see how that patient responds. Not everyone, but yes, if there is some downward trend of saturation, these set of patients may benefit.
So monitor closely, try other anti-inflammatory, but keep steroids in your background. Any other comments from anyone else?
Sir, I think if after 10th day, we are going to add steroids, should we add antibiotic? Because it can be secondary infection.
Okay, that's why clinical evaluation is more important also. If there's definite evidence of secondary infection, like the other day, one patient had elevated CRP, it was the 13th day, but was complaining of severe pain in the throat and had very bad tonsillitis, if I put it that way. And therefore, obviously had the rise in CRP because of a secondary throat infection. So that patient obviously would benefit from antibiotics rather than steroids. So you have to look at the clinical picture also.
Right. The other question is how long steroids can be used in case of patients with severe pneumonia and not improving clinically, or the SpO2 not improving. Neeraj, you want to take that?
So again, depending on sometime what happens that if the lung damage is there, say if the CT severity on higher side, the saturation may take time to come back to normal. So just increasing the dose of steroid over time is not going to help. And in that situation, ensuring that the patient is able to maintain saturation somewhere around 92, especially if whatever oxygenation strategy you are using, that should be fine. And the high dose of steroid after 4 or 5 days usually won't work unless the patient's oxygen saturation and progression is there. If patient has stabilized, say the patient is on 10 liters, so he may continue requiring 10 liters for some time before it starts improving. So unless the patient's oxygen requirement is increasing, there is no point in increasing the dose of steroid over time. And after say 1 week, we should try to taper it down to a level where one can sustain the at least the current level of the oxygen level, or the patient has started showing improvement from that level. So sometimes oxygen dependence actually persists for some time before it starts coming down.
Right. Anybody would like to add? But I think that's what we need to do. There are a couple of questions on D-dimer. One is that, as the question put by Professor Guleria, where, in between a mild and moderate patient has fever and probable signs of inflammation coming up without hypoxia. So at what level of D-dimer would you like to add anticoagulation, if at all? So suppose his D-dimer is 2 times or 3 times and he's still not hypoxic, like we are trying steroids in this group, is there a merit in adding anticoagulants also? Manish, would you like to take that?
So I tried to address this question. Maybe it was not clearly at that time. So
Manish, could you be closer to the mic?
Yeah. Regarding D-dimer in non-hypoxic patients, is that right?
Yeah, that's right.
So as we discussed, yes, D-dimer would be elevated to some extent, even as a marker of inflammation. So what level of D-dimer above which one needs to treat? There is no sufficient data to say that. Currently, even D-dimer monitoring in patients who are mild patients in home isolation, not hypoxic, that is even not warranted, because there are no cutoff levels above which we are going to treat. There's no management decisions that we can take based upon the D-dimer level as of current available evidence.
Okay,
you
before
like
we
to
cut, I'd just like to
Yeah.
add that I'll ask Ambuj and Anjan to continue because I have another meeting at 4. So
Right.
I just like to myself, but Anjan wanted to say something.
Sir, no, I just wanted to add that as pointed out by Manish, D-dimer value of X or more than Y is not important, but we have to consider whether a patient is obese, he or she is going to lie on the bed for a long time in a hospital setting. So all those criteria for which we used to give anticoagulants prophylactically have to be kept in mind in a COVID-19 scenario, which again can cause thrombosis. So one has to individualize all patient, and we really can't have a blanket value. If it is more than X plus 1, we do this. This is only I wanted to say, sir.
Right. Another question which has come, it's kind of related to now what is happening with COVID is, somebody has very rightly asked is, how do you suspect and how do you diagnose mucormycosis in the current scenario? So, Dr. Anjan, would you like to, how to suspect and diagnose mucormycosis? And Neeraj could add.
Most of the patients whom we've seen have come to us with a diagnosed test for mucormycosis, and then only they have landed here with us because they became positive and were coming for the hospital for treatment. So unless mucor is diagnosed as per a fungal test from let's say secretions or let's say biopsy, it should not be labeled as mucor. And I'm really afraid that in the near future, patients would be receiving amphotericin B prophylactically again, like it has been happening in the past 1 year. Every drug has been used prophylactically. So let us be very clear and put it across to the whole world, at least in India, that mucor needs a diagnosis which is done in a lab from a sample, and only then it has to be treated. If it is the upper airway, let's say sinuses, the ENT people will have to be involved, because we see quite a lot of patients who have impending vision failures or already have had vision failures who are coming to us. So there should be a low threshold of diagnosing mucor, especially when they go to physicians, and then that has to be treated aggressively with amphotericin B and or posaconazole.
I agree. I mean, it's a very toxic drug. To be careful before we start that. But Neeraj, you'd like to add anything on the diagnosis part?
Yes, sir. So again, this could actually a warning that we might fall short as far as MPOV is concerned. So
Yes.
we have to gear up for that. And as far as those patients who are at risk, say a diabetic patient who has uncontrolled diabetic, who has been put on steroid during COVID-19, or even for that matter, tocilizumab for that matter, those who have been on immunosuppression, or those who have some reason for having underlying immunosuppression, these are patients at high risk. And if they complain of, say, pain around their eyes, nose, sinus area, fullness in that area, if they have epistaxis or these type of symptoms which may point out that their sinuses may be involved, these are the patients who actually warrant this thing evaluation for mucormycosis. So that's the only thing, sir.
The other question been asked, and this has been been going on for several webinars, is how long should anticoagulants be given in a patient who are discharged from hospital? And again, if talking about investigations, does D-dimer kind of determine how long, or do you need a prolonged anticoagulation? Manish, you want to take that? The question is, how long should anticoagulants be given after discharge, and can D-dimer kind of help in deciding?
So we try to address this through a question whether a D-dimer should be done at discharge to decide upon anticoagulation. So if a patient has recovered well, is mobile, really there is no need to go after the D-dimer level and think about anticoagulation. Obviously, as Professor Anjan said, yes, if a patient has some features, is likely to be bed-bound for a while for whatever comorbidity the patient might be having, yes, in those circumstances, we have to go the levels and we need to anticoagulate. And this is as per previous guidelines as we used to do in other acute medical conditions. Nothing specific to COVID per se. So if someone with a stroke with COVID recovers, obviously we will be giving, and it will be as per previous existing guidelines.
Yeah, so that's right. I mean, it's like any critical illness, that whether he's ambulatory or not, whether he has atrial fibrillation or not, whether there is a DVT or not. There are certain scores which have been used, like VT score or improved VT score. So all that can be used to be a little more objective if you want to be. The next question is, again, I think this has been partly answered, is the question which, like Valeria had asked, again, our occurrence of fever at the 10th day. Would you, Manish, would like to do a CRP or other inflammatory markers before you start steroids? Because, you know, now there is, even in the national guidelines, indication of using steroids in non-hypoxic patients if they develop fever after 8 to 10 days.
So this is a very pertinent question which was discussed quite a lot when these guidelines were being framed of giving steroids. But then again, if we do literature search, CRP levels are elevated in all patients with COVID. So what levels will we use as a cutoff for giving steroid? There is no data per se. So it may be 3 times, 5 times, 10 times, we don't know. So if we don't really know what to do with the investigation, why should we be doing it at first place? So I think the guidelines are pretty simple on that part. It has mainly relied on the clinical criteria that is of persistent high-grade fever and a cough which is worsening. So these two criteria have been kept as a clinical criteria. Obviously, we do not have enough data as of now, but if data comes, we show some very good correlation with CRP values. A single value of CRP, I doubt it will. Then yes, we may have to revisit the same. But at this point in time, I don't think there is much added benefit of doing a CRP in this group of patients.
Would you like to add something, Dr. Anjan? Or?
Yeah, I think Manish has said all the right things, but what is important is that if you, we sitting in the, tertiary care center, we can follow our guidelines. We have 10 scales. You mentioned a scale about pulmonary embolism, thromboembolism, but let's go to the periphery and see what is happening even in Delhi. So steroids is the mainstay. And if you are able to break the fever cycle, then steroids are a wonder drug. So if you ask people who are treating COVID-19 patients, the moment a fever starts, let's say 8th day, even if it is 100, a steroid is started all over again. And this time it is started with a higher dosage. you try to convince them, but then it's a different kind of a patient profile or practice profile which you have. I think Manish had said rightly that unless we have a correlation with high fever, steroids, and our biomarkers, maybe we'll not be able to convince people who are giving steroids always and who are trying to do all these markers for all patients.
Right. Just one question, sir. I think you mentioned this about IL-6. It's an expensive investigation, very sensitive to how you collect, how you analyze. So really, I think Manish, Neeraj, one of you can take it and Dr. Anjan can add to it. What are the indications for doing IL-6?
So the only indication probably I can think of is when we are considering anti-IL-6 therapy, tocilizumab. But then again, if you look at it, all the trials, RCTs that have used tocilizumab, they have used CRP as a surrogate and they have not used the IL-6 levels. And there are many caveats of IL-6 level. Technically, even if the sample is kept for long before analysis, the levels will go up. If it is shaken too much while being transported to the lab, the levels will go up. So really, it is not a very reliable thing to take such important decisions. I hardly see any use after 1 year of our understanding of this fancy cousin of CRP. I don't see hardly any use for IL-6. We should stick to CRP.
I agree. And even in mild cases, it's being done as part of the panel, which just makes no sense. I don't see any other question on the chat box. Anybody on the panel would like to? Yes, sir, please.
I think this has to be put across in a big way regarding IL-6.
Yes.
I said it earlier, I'm saying it again. A CRP is, let's not call it a poor cousin and call IL-6 a fancy cousin, because people want to do fancy things and people don't want to do poor things. Let us say that IL-6 has no value. Being honest, I can assure you that none of the people who are ordering IL-6 or who are doing it in their wards or hospitals will be aware what is the half-life, whether it has been taken in the right container, whether the whole thing was sent in a car somewhere where it was, the road was bad. Those values are not on. And now everybody tends to talk about 3 times the normal value, 4 times the normal value. The TOSI is there. That's the problem. That's the reason the cost of TOSI is so much. It is a sought after drug, because suddenly everybody thinks if TOSI is more than 3 times, IL-6 is more than 3 times TOSI is needed. Nothing else is required. And then along with IL-6, ferritin and LDH come free. So you have a high IL-6, ferritin more than 1500. Nobody is bothered about anything else. Only IL-6 is high and TOSI has to be given. So I think we at the prime centers would have to put it down. We will have to say we don't need to measure IL-6 levels the way we are doing it. And let us put across to everybody that once you have given TOSI, there is no reason that you should be doing IL-6 after 24, 36 and 72 hours. It is going to come high, and then again you're going to be saying, please get one more vial of TOSI. Somebody is again driving at breakneck speed and getting it for lakh of rupees. So the main institutions of the government would need to, and corporate hospitals who are doing the right things would have to put it across that, well, again, TOSI is not the wonder drug. And more important is IL-6 is not a biomarker which is to be done. We can do very well, and like Manish has pointed out, that all the trials which have been published and conducted, they have never talked about IL-6. They have all talked about CRPs, and CRP is readily available in all hospitals. I just want to put this across.
I think we can keep repeating so that hopefully the home message somehow reaches at least some people, so that there is some benefits coming out of it. So any other panelists would like to add something on biomarkers that they, in addition to all what we have discussed, or just supplement something? Because I don't see any other question on the chat box.
So regarding the query which Dr. Mahapatra from Bhubaneswar raised, that thing, why can't we do so that why can't things can be streamlined? Now this webinar is conducted by Ministry of Health. Any drug which is given approval by DCGI, everybody start thinking that this is the wonder drug, and the demand for that drug, and I will say misuse of that drug starts right at that particular day. So why can't we have a guidance that if a drug is released, given approval by DCGI, it doesn't mean that everyone is going to use that drug at every level. It should not be that way. If some drug has been given emergency use authorization, the data pertaining to that particular drug when used in any of the patients should be collected and compared. It should not be given scot-free, okay, you just give it and forget about it. So I think it's high time that we have to take a call that what should be the ideal treatment protocol. Not everybody requires plasma, not everybody requires remdesivir, not everyone requires tocilizumab or any of the zumabs, bevacizumab, itolizumab. Whatever zumab you think of, everybody is trying that thing, which is totally wrong, and we might be harming our patient more than doing any good. So this has to come from higher authorities ki no, enough is enough. Maybe we are losing patients just because of this carelessness on our part. And this is so unfortunate. CKD patient receiving 2 units of plasma and landing up in pulmonary edema. And you just because patient has moderate COVID, that means he had to give plasma. That's not like that. And somebody has to take a call on this, and this has to go down to save life. We are taking life just like that.
Right. Yeah. I see somebody from Nigrim Shillong. Please.
Sir, here in Nigrims, we have almost all the facility that is available to do all the markers. But till now, sir, here in the Nigrims, we haven't used the tocilizumab also, and we never used the Flaviflu also. It is just because we have, it's not necessary that we have to use that. And many times what we have seen that not the drugs that is very good is only the steroid and anticoagulant. And one more thing, sir, I want to just highlight here, we haven't included here this procalcitonin. The role of procalcitonin is differentiating when the patient deteriorated, to differentiate between whether it is really because of the viral disease or it is some superadded infection is now occurring. That's why the patient is having some problem. Role of procalcitonin, sir.
Okay.
Procalcitonin
Can I add something?
has to be raised in late COVID-19. So if a patient is in late form, then it doesn't always portend that he's landing up into some sepsis. So you have to be clinically vigilant if there is other, if you have any focus of infection or not. But Procal can be raised in later half of COVID-19 as well. We have to be careful while interpreting.
Yeah, Professor Anjan, yeah.
Yeah, if you look at the history of Procal, 10 years ago, I think Procal was being tried, and there were some reports coming in various journals. And ultimately, if you see all the meta-analysis and the take-home message as far as Procal was concerned was that it is of some benefit if one tries to de-escalate antibiotics. This was the bottom line. So to try to escalate antibiotics, well, Procal has never been found useful, and there is no trial or a meta-analysis which has tried to tell us this. So let's be very careful. But because these things are now ordered as investigations at biomarkers, they are being used quite often. If all the people who have listened to this, if you see with what kind of energy and Neeraj is trying to put across the usage of various drugs, it shows that what kind of patients we have been dealing. We have received patients where Methylene Blue has been used intranasally to take care of COVID-19. Colchicine has been rampantly used all over the country, even in Delhi. We in our ICU have 2 patients who have been on colchicine before they came to us. And mind you, they are not normal. They are, they are people from high income strata. They are people who are doctors themselves. And so where is the guideline of using colchicine? So if you use Fabiflu, fine, the government has allowed it, the drug controller has allowed it. You may have a different opinion about that. But to use drugs which are not allowed, and we all know in the working in the ICUs that Methylene Blue, there are case reports where it is being used as a vasoplastic, especially when a sepsis, a patient in septic shock, there is nothing else left with us there. You are using all 3 inotropes, 4 inotropes to the max dose. Well, you can try Methylene Blue. But now it is being used like anything. So let's accept it. India is a tough country to be as a doctor. And there are no regulatory authorities where things can be done. Similarly is investigation, similarly is treatment.
Right. Yeah, please. Yeah. You're muted. You're muted. If you could unmute yourself.
Hello.
Yeah, yeah. Go
Yeah.
ahead.
So nowadays, sir, because of this, some during the discharge, the blanket use of antiplatelets, sir. Now, because of this, now we are facing means now new things that every now and then we get the complaint that the patient is having some bleeding problems. So we have to provide a very good guidelines that we should stop this practice of giving the antiplatelet or anticoagulants in all category of the patient at the time of discharge. Because of this practice, we are facing these things that every now and then the patient complains of the bleeding.
You're absolutely right. Like everything else, aspirin and anticoagulation have been very widely overused or abused, as you may like to say. And as Sir was saying, the more the merrier doesn't hold true for medicine. It's not that all the medicines that you have kind of heard of being associated with COVID management, if you add that, you will get better outcomes. But I guess it's very difficult to change behavior practices for patients and for physicians. But I think the message very clear is that we have to be very prudent in our use of biomarkers or all the drugs in the armamentarium for management of COVID. Since I see no other questions and if there is nothing from any center of excellence, regional center of excellence, then I would ask Professor Anjan to just give his concluding remarks and before we close down.
Thank you, Ambuj, and take this opportunity to thank all the panelists and Manish, who gave us an excellent FAQ kind of a lecture, which really was very crisp and sharp, so that you could hit the hammer on the nail head. We need to put across to the country and from these centers of excellence that biomarkers and tests have to be used sparingly and wherever required. At the present time, if you realize that none of the centers, including us, is even thinking about the money which is being spent. We need to wait and we need to see after whenever this pandemic goes off, what happens to the economy. I can assure you that most of the funds which were supposed to come to us will not be coming anymore. We will not be buying our CT scans or various machines or gadgetries. So let us try to conserve funds. Let us try to do biomarkers wherever they are required, and let each one of the wards or the units or the hospital or COVID centers make a guideline. Well, fine, at admission, we will do this. If this goes wrong at 72 hours, we will do this. And let us try to manage all these things and spend the least amount of money which is available. Thank you very much. And
right. Thank you, sir. I think there's a very nice remark from Dr. D.K. Jha to everybody, and kind of sums up the webinar for today. It says only CBC, CRP, D-dimer are needed in COVID patients. Other biomarker tests may just reflect ignorance of treating physicians. So on that note, I'll again thank you all for joining. And tomorrow we'll have a discussion on diabetes, management of blood sugar and diabetes in patients of COVID-19. So thank you all again once again.